He would get stiffer, man. He would jar you sometime, and I said, Chris, you're killing me. Kicks and And he was just a big old huge kind of guy.
Hillbilly Jim names 5 wrestlers who tried to get him banned. That is the promise. That is the headline. Somewhere out there is a list of 5 men who wanted the big bearded country boy thrown out of wrestling for good. It sounds perfect. It sounds like exactly the kind of story wrestling fans love to hear. There is only one problem with it. The proof does not exist. Not one interview, not one recording, not one transcript where Jim Morris sat down and named 5 wrestlers who tried to get him banned from the World Wrestling Federation. So where did this story come from, and why does it feel so easy to believe? Before we go further, do me a favor and hit that like button, then subscribe to the channel. It really does help, and it keeps stories like this one coming. Now let us get into it. Start with the claim itself, because the claim is everywhere. Spend 10 minutes on the wrestling side of the internet, and you will see the same shape again and again. A legend's name, a number, a promise of secrets. Hillbilly Jim names the wrestlers he hated. Hillbilly Jim reveals the men who wanted him gone. Hillbilly Jim exposes the 5 who tried to get him banned. The wording changes a little. The idea never changes at all. The idea is always the same. A beloved old star finally breaks his silence. He sits down somewhere, in some room, and he starts naming names. He tells you who plotted against him. He tells you who went to the office behind his back. He tells you who wanted him off television forever. It is a great idea for a video. It is also, in this case, not supported by anything. The research behind this story is very clear about that. A full review of historical archives, shoot interview catalogs, and media records turned up nothing. No interview, no audio recording, no transcript. Nowhere does Jim Morris make that claim. The whole 5 wrestlers idea is described as a false premise, one that was created inside modern digital media rather than inside a wrestling locker room. That is the first big problem, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. We are not talking about a story that is simply hard to confirm. We are not talking about a rumor that might turn out to be true. We are talking about a claim with nothing under it at all. So the honest thing to do here is not to pretend there is a lost tape somewhere. There is no secret interview waiting to be found. There is no missing shoot where Jim finally opened up and let it all out. If that evidence existed, it would be easy to point at. It does not exist. Which leaves a far more interesting question. If nobody can show you the interview, why does the story keep spreading? The answer has very little to do with Hillbilly Jim, and a lot to do with how modern wrestling content gets made. There is a whole category of channels built on nostalgia for the 1980s. That era sells. The old WWF boom years are full of larger-than-life characters, bright colors, and fans who still remember every single match. People want to go back there, and where people want to go back, somebody will always find a way to sell that feeling back to them. A lot of these channels do not really write videos. They assemble them. They use title templates. The template is simple. Take a famous name from the past, add a number, add a strong emotional word, then fill in the middle later. Wrestlers he hated, wrestlers he feared, wrestlers who wanted him fired, wrestlers who tried to get him banned. Swap the name at the front, and the template still works. That is the whole point of a template. It works on anybody. Now here is the part that makes these videos feel real. They do not invent everything from nothing. They take real pieces of wrestling history and glue them together in the wrong order. Wrestling actually does have documented backstage conflict. Real disputes happened. Savio Vega had well-known problems with the group known as the Click. Brock Lesnar and Paul Heyman have sat down for real interviews and talked openly about the business. Those things happened. Those conversations exist. But a template does not care who the conflict belonged to. So the conflict gets lifted out of one man's career and dropped into another man's career. Real hostility from one corner of the industry gets attached to a performer who never had any of it. The story keeps its edge. It just loses its owner. That is what happened here. Genuine backstage politics from elsewhere in wrestling got quietly stapled onto a man who, by every account in the research, was one of the most easily liked people in the building. There is a second trick involved too, and it is even simpler. It works by taking things Hillbilly Jim really did say and bending them into a shape he never meant. Jim has done plenty of real interviews. He has talked about how strong certain men were. He has talked about who could genuinely fight. He has talked about the physical power of people like Haku and the Barbarian. Those are real comments about real peers. But strip a comment out of its context and it changes completely. A sentence about how tough a man was can be edited to sound like a warning. A story about a rough opponent can be cut down until it sounds like a grudge. Nothing new has to be written. The words are already there. They just get pointed in a different direction. Do that a few times, add a dramatic title, and you have a video about backstage sabotage, built entirely out of compliments. That brings us to the biggest source of confusion of all, and if you understand this one thing, you will never get fooled by these videos again. Wrestling has two separate histories running side by side. The first one is kayfabe. Kayfabe is the show. It is the scripted part. It is the storylines, the characters, the rivalries, written to sell tickets. In kayfabe, men absolutely do try to end each other's careers. Managers scheme, heels plot. Somebody is always trying to run somebody else out of the company. That is the job. That is what the audience paid for. The second history is the real one. That is the locker room. That is the travel, the friendships, the politics, the actual working relationships between people who share a dressing room 300 nights a year. That side of the business comes out in shoot interviews, where a wrestler sits down without a script and talks about what really happened. Those two histories look almost identical from the outside. Same names, same faces, same arenas. The only difference is which one is real. And that is exactly the gap these videos live in. Because if a wrestler spent 1985 being attacked on television by a group of men trying to drive him out of the company, you can build a very convincing lie out of that. You do not even need to change the names. You just quietly stop mentioning that it was a story. So a scripted feud becomes a real conspiracy. A heel manager becomes a backstage enemy. A written angle becomes a secret plot. And the viewer never notices the swap, because everything they are being shown genuinely happened. It just happened on a television screen, on purpose, in front of a paying crowd. Keep that in your head for the rest of this, because it is the key to the whole thing. Hillbilly Jim had enemies. He had a lot of them. Every single one of them was written down in advance. To see how ridiculous the band story really is, you have to understand where Jim Morris actually stood inside that company. He was found in Florida. He did not fight his way in through the back door, and he did not arrive with a reputation for trouble. He was brought into the organization under the personal guidance of Pat Patterson, Chief Jay Strongbow, and Vince McMahon. Those were not small names. That is the top of the food chain taking a personal interest in a new man. In late 1984, he was given the Hillbilly Jim persona. Then came the part that made him. The character was introduced through a long television campaign in early 1985. The idea was clever and very simple. Jim was presented as a fan, just a big enthusiastic country boy sitting in the front row at live events, loving every second of it, dancing along, having the time of his life. Week after week, there he was. Then he crossed the guardrail. He climbed over to help Hulk Hogan. Not a mid-card act, not a rising star. Hogan, the single biggest draw the company had, in the middle of the hottest run in its history. And Hogan trained him, on television. In vignette after vignette, the biggest star in wrestling personally took this fan and turned him into a wrestler in front of the audience. Think about what that means in terms of standing. From the very first day of his career, Hillbilly Jim was tied directly to the top of the card. He was Hogan's project. He was Hogan's friend. He was on television constantly, in a family-friendly product, with the full support of the office. That friendship with Hogan was not just a storyline either. The research describes it as a close personal friendship, and that friendship, combined with his alignment with executive leadership, put Morris in a highly protected position inside the organization. Now think about the era he was working in. The 1980s were not gentle. Territories were at war with each other. Politics inside the locker room were aggressive. Rosters turned over constantly. People were fighting for spots, for money, for television time, and the business had a reputation for being ruthless about all of it. And in the middle of all that, Jim Morris was widely noted for three things: personal warmth, political neutrality, high standing among his peers. Read that again: political neutrality. In a locker room famous for politics, the man was known for staying out of them. Far from facing peer-driven attempts to banish him or get him fired, Morris was seen across the locker room as a dependable and highly marketable asset. He made the company money. He made the family-friendly product work. He was easy to work with. He was liked. That is not a man in danger. That is a man everybody wants to keep. So now put the title back on the table and look at how badly it fits. If 5 wrestlers were genuinely trying to get Hillbilly Jim banned, you would expect to see the wreckage of it somewhere. That is not how these things stay quiet. Real backstage wars leave marks. Somebody talks. Somebody gets moved. Somebody disappears from television. Careers get shortened. Relationships get broken. Decades later, people are still arguing about it in interviews. None of that is here. Instead, the record shows the opposite in almost every direction. A close relationship with the biggest star in the business. Trust from management. A reputation for being neutral and easy to deal with. Years and years of steady work. And then comes the detail that really closes the door on the whole idea. When his active in-ring career finished, Vince McMahon did not let him drift away. McMahon moved him into executive and administrative work inside the company. From 1990 through 2001, Jim Morris represented the organization around the world as a senior sales executive. He worked for Coliseum Video and later Sony Videos. He handled major retail accounts with national corporations: Walmart, Kmart, Blockbuster Video. Sit with that for a second. That is 11 years. That is more than a decade of the company sending him out to deal with its biggest business partners. You do not hand that job to someone the locker room wanted gone. You do not put a man with a poisoned reputation in front of Walmart. You do not trust a problem employee with your retail relationships for 11 straight years. That single fact does more damage to the band story than any argument could. A man who was supposedly being pushed out of wrestling was instead kept inside the business, in a suit, selling the company's product to the biggest chains in America. So if that is the reality, where do the wrestlers come from? Because there are wrestlers in this story. That part is not invented. Hillbilly Jim really did have men lined up against him, and their names are real. They were just never trying to get him banned from anything. And there is a reason those men come as a group, which is probably the single most important detail in this entire story. Wrestling in that era ran on stables. A stable is a team of villains gathered under one manager, all working towards the same goal on screen. Bobby, the Brain Heenan, ran one of the best of them. His job, week after week, was to point his men at a popular wrestler and try to remove that wrestler from the picture. Read that back slowly. A group of wrestlers, under a common plan, trying to drive one man out of the company. That is a stable. That is also, almost word for word, the description of a backstage conspiracy. So the raw material was already sitting there, fully formed, in the television footage. You do not need to invent a group of enemies for Hillbilly Jim. The company built him one on purpose, gave them a leader, put them on camera every week, and paid them to be as convincing as possible. All modern clickbait has to do is take that group, count them, and quietly change one word. Change storyline to secret, change angle to plot, change opponents to enemies. Everything else stays exactly the same. Same names, same footage, same shouting commentary. That is why this particular lie is so hard to spot. It is not built out of fiction. It is built out of the truth, with the label peeled off. So let us go through them properly. 5 wrestlers, counted down one by one. Not 5 men who tried to get Hillbilly Jim banned, because the research does not support that and never will. These are the 5 men whose real conflicts with Hillbilly Jim are the raw material. These are the names that get recycled, restaged, and quietly turned into something they never were. We start at number 5. Number 5 is Mr. Fuji. After Hillbilly Jim returned to full-time competition, he and his storyline family found themselves working against Bobby, the Brain Heenan's stable. Heenan's group was one of the most effective collections of rule breakers the company had. If you were a fan favorite in that era, sooner or later you were going to end up in their path. Mr. Fuji was one of the rule breakers Jim and his relatives battled through that stretch. That is the documented on-screen relationship. Opponents, adversaries, 2 sides of a wrestling program. Now notice how easy it would be to twist that. Fuji is a name with weight. He is remembered as a cunning presence, someone associated with underhanded tactics on television. Put his name next to Hillbilly Jim's and add the word banned, and a lot of people would nod along without questioning it. It sounds plausible, but plausible is not the same as true. There is nothing in the research that turns Mr. Fuji into a backstage enemy of Jim Morris. Nothing that shows him lobbying management. Nothing that shows him campaigning to have Jim removed. What exists is a television feud, booked by the company, designed to sell tickets and draw a reaction from a crowd. And here is the thing about that era. Getting into a feud with a strong heel act was not a punishment. It was an opportunity. It meant you were being used. It meant the company had plans for you. Being on the receiving end of a beating on television is not evidence that somebody hated you. Very often, it is evidence that somebody trusted you to make money. That is the first name on the list, and already the pattern is visible. Real conflict. Real footage. Zero proof of anything behind the curtain. Number 4 is Don Morocco. Morocco was another of the rule breakers connected to that same run of storylines. Same stable, same era, same collection of on-screen conflicts with Hillbilly Jim and his family characters. And Morocco is a useful example, because he is exactly the kind of name that makes these fake stories work. He was a serious performer with a hard edge. He looked like a man who could genuinely hurt you. That is a gift to anyone writing a false headline, because the audience does half the work themselves. They see the name, they picture the man, and they fill in the rest. But look at what is actually being claimed. The suggestion is that Don Morocco was part of a group working to get Hillbilly Jim removed from the company, To believe that, you would need something, a quote, a recording, a single account from someone who was there. There is none. What there is instead is a normal professional relationship between two performers in the same company, playing opposite roles, doing the job they were hired to do. Morocco was cast as an obstacle. Jim was cast as the man overcoming obstacles. That is not a conspiracy. That is a script. And this is where you have to be careful with wrestling history, because the industry spent decades deliberately blurring that line. For most of the 20th century, the business protected its stories fiercely. Fans were meant to believe the hatred was real. That was the entire craft. So when modern content takes those old images and presents them as backstage truth, it is not doing something new. It is repeating a very old trick with a modern coat of paint. The difference is that the old version was part of the show. The new version pretends to be history. Number 3 is Big John Studd. Now we move up in size and in significance. Because Studd was not just a name on a card. He was a genuine heavyweight attraction, one of the men the company built major matches around. The research is specific about the relationship here. Big John Studd was a heavyweight heel with whom Morris worked extensive arena circuits and headline attraction matches. Read that carefully, because every word of it matters. Extensive arena circuits. That means they were sent out together, night after night, town after town. Headline attraction matches. That means they were trusted to be the reason people bought tickets. Now ask yourself something simple. Does a company send a man on the road for months as the top attraction against a wrestler who is quietly trying to have him banned? Does the office keep pairing two men together in main events if one of them is campaigning to end the other's career? Of course not. That is not how a business runs. The men who worked together most closely in that era were often the men who trusted each other most. You cannot have a good match with someone you cannot rely on. In that ring, at that size, with that much weight moving around, safety comes down to trust. A wrestler who is being sabotaged does not get put in headline matches with the man doing the sabotaging. He gets kept as far away from him as possible. So the very evidence that these videos use, the fact that Studd and Hillbilly Jim were locked together in big matches over a long period, actually proves the opposite of what they claim. It shows a working partnership, not a war. That is the strange thing about this whole genre. The proof is right there in front of everybody. It just says the wrong thing, so it gets described instead of read. Number 2 is King Kong Bundy. Bundy was one of the biggest attractions of the entire period. A huge man, presented as almost unstoppable, and another of the rule breakers connected to those Heenan-aligned storylines. He and Hillbilly Jim also worked extensive arena circuits together in headline attraction matches, exactly as Studd did. And Bundy might be the single best example of how the confusion works. On television, a man like Bundy existed to be a threat. His whole presentation was built around the idea that he could end somebody. Crowds genuinely worried for the man in the ring with him. That reaction was the product. That fear was the ticket. So now imagine taking 20 seconds of that footage, adding a caption, and calling it evidence. Bundy standing over a fallen Hillbilly Jim, the commentary shouting, the crowd horrified. It looks like proof of something terrible. It is proof of a well-executed wrestling match. This is the trap, and it is worth naming clearly. Wrestling produces images of hatred on purpose. It is one of the only forms of entertainment that manufactures convincing footage of people trying to destroy each other, then puts that footage in a permanent archive. Decades later, anybody can pull it out and present it without context. The performers understood that. The fans of the era understood it too, whether they admitted it or not. What has been lost is not the truth. What has been lost is the frame around the truth. Take the frame away, and a wrestling match looks exactly like a crime. Number 1 is Roddy Piper. If there is one name that gives this whole false story its power, it is this one. In 1985, Roddy Piper engaged in a high-profile feud with Hillbilly Jim, and the point of that feud was very specific. Piper was attempting to prevent Jim's alignment with Hulk Hogan. Now stop, and look at how perfectly that fits the fake version. A wrestler actively working to stop Hillbilly Jim from getting close to the biggest star in the business. A man trying to keep him away from the top of the card. A rival attempting to block his rise before it even started. Written out in cold text, with no context at all, that reads exactly like backstage politics. It reads like jealousy. It reads like a veteran trying to strangle a newcomer's career in the crib. But that was the storyline. That was the announced plot of a televised feud in 1985. Piper's character was supposed to want Jim out of Hogan's orbit. That was the conflict the audience was sold, and Piper was extraordinarily good at selling it. He was one of the best in history at making an audience believe he genuinely despised somebody. That skill is exactly why his name ends up in these videos. He was so convincing as an antagonist that 30 years later, people are still willing to accept the character as the man. And that is not fair to him either. This kind of content damages both sides. It invents victims and it invents villains. Hillbilly Jim gets turned into someone who spent his career under siege, and Roddy Piper gets turned into a man plotting in corridors, when what actually happened was two professionals executing one of the hottest angles of the year. So there is your list. Fuji, Morocco, Stud, Bundy, Piper. 5 real names, 5 real conflicts, and not one shred of evidence that any of them tried to have Jim Morris banned from anything. 5 men who were paid to look like his enemies. And that is the point where it all starts to make sense. Once you know that 5 genuine antagonists exist in the footage, you can see exactly how the fake list gets built. You do not have to invent a single name, you just have to describe what is already on the tape and let the viewer assume the rest. There is one more piece of the story that gets pulled into this, and it is probably the most misunderstood part of Hillbilly Jim's entire career: the broken leg. Shortly after his debut, Morris suffered a severe broken leg. It was completely legitimate. There was nothing scripted about it. He was chasing manager Johnny V around the ring at a television taping when it happened. Think about the timing of that. He had just arrived. He had just been introduced to the audience through months of build. He was Hogan's protege, one of the hottest new acts in the company, and then his leg was broken. Now look at what the company did next, because this is the part that matters. They did not shelve the character. They did not quietly move on and find someone else. The WWF introduced his storyline family to keep the gimmick alive while he recovered. Uncle Elmer, played by Stan Frazier. Cousin Junior, played by Lanny Keene and later Gene Petite. Cousin Luke. An entire family of characters was created to protect one man's spot while he healed. That is not what happens to a performer the company is trying to get rid of. That is what happens to an investment. The gimmick was too valuable to lose, so they built around it until he could come back. But you can see how this becomes fuel, can you not? A serious injury, right at the start of a career, sustained during a chase involving a heel manager. Twist the language slightly, and it sounds sinister. Say he was hurt by a manager. Say he was taken off television. Say the company had to replace him. Every one of those sentences can be arranged to sound like the beginning of a conspiracy. The truth is much duller and much more human. A big man ran awkwardly and his leg broke. It was an accident, in a physically dangerous job, in a business full of them. Real events do not need help to be dramatic. They just need to be reported honestly. Which brings us to the part of this story that these videos never touch, and it is the part that dismantles them completely. Because Hillbilly Jim has talked. A lot. He has sat down for real interviews with outlets like RF Video, The Hannibal TV, and Title Match Wrestling. These are proper long-form conversations. Unscripted, no storyline, no company line to protect. The exact format where a man is free to settle old scores if he has any to settle. And what does he do with all that time? He praises people. Consistently, across those interviews, Morris speaks about his contemporaries with deep professional respect. When he is asked about the men he shared a locker room with, he does not reach for grudges. He reaches for compliments. Start with the biggest one, because it is the most famous thing he says. Haku, Tonga Fifita, also known to fans as Meng. Morris identifies him as the undisputed toughest legitimate fighter in professional wrestling history. Not one of the toughest, the toughest. That is a serious statement from a man who spent years in dressing rooms full of enormous, dangerous people. But here is the part that gets cut out of the clickbait versions, and it is the part that tells you who Jim Morris actually is. In the same breath, he praises Haku as a warm, mild-mannered family man outside the ring. Sit with that contrast for a second, because it is the whole lesson of this video in one sentence. The most physically frightening man in the business was also, according to Jim, one of the kindest. Terrifying in a ring, gentle in life. That single observation destroys the logic these fake videos run on. They assume that if a wrestler talks about how dangerous somebody was, he must have been afraid of him. They assume respect is a form of hostility. They assume that naming a hard man is the same as naming an enemy. Morris does the exact opposite. He tells you the man could genuinely fight, and then he tells you the man was lovely. Then there is the barbarian, Sione Vailahi, noted alongside Haku as an exceptionally powerful and universally respected athlete in the locker room. Another huge man, another name that would look perfect in a video about people who wanted Hillbilly Jim gone. And again, what Jim actually offers is admiration, respect for a peer's strength and standing. That is it. There is no dark second half to the story. There is no bitter twist waiting at the end. Then there is Andre the Giant. This one goes further than respect. Andrei Rusimov was a close personal friend and a tag team partner. Morris traveled extensively with him and held him in deep affection. Traveled with him. That word carries a lot of weight in wrestling. The road was where the real relationships were formed. Hours in cars, night after night, town after town. You cannot fake your way through that. The people you travel with are the people who know you. And Jim's travel partner was one of the most beloved figures the industry ever produced. Then you have Big John Studd and King Kong Bundy again. The same two men we counted down earlier. In the honest record, they appear exactly as what they were. Heavyweight opponents. Professional colleagues. Men he shared headline matches and long arena tours with. Not enemies. Co-workers. So look at what we actually have. A man with hours of unscripted interviews on record, and the worst thing he does in any of them is call somebody incredibly tough. Now hold that up against the title one more time. The title promises 5 enemies. It promises secrets, grudges, and a man finally getting revenge after decades of silence. The record gives you something almost completely different. A respected locker room figure, a close relationship with Hulk Hogan, strong ties to management, a reputation for staying out of politics entirely, successful on-screen rivalries that made money, genuine friendships, open praise for his peers, and a long career inside the company after the wrestling stopped. Every single one of those things points in the same direction, and it is the opposite direction to the headline. That is not a small gap between story and reality. That is the widest gap you could possibly have. The fake version and the real version are not even arguing about the same man. In fact, once you start looking at it this way, you realize that almost every moment in Hillbilly Jim's career now exists in 3 separate versions. There is the myth version, invented online. There is the kayfabe version, written by the company. And there is the real version, which is the one nobody bothers to make videos about. Take the time he spent off television. The myth version says he was suspended or forced off screen because of backstage political maneuvering. Somebody with power wanted him gone, so he vanished for a while. The kayfabe version says he was taken out by heel managers and their heavyweights. Attacked, targeted, injured by men who wanted him out of the way. The real version is that he broke his leg chasing Johnny V, and the company built a family of characters to keep his spot warm until he could walk again. Now take the end of his in-ring career. The myth version says he was forced out of professional wrestling early, blacklisted by an industry that had turned on him. The kayfabe version says he retired quietly to Mudlick, Kentucky, going home to the hills where the character came from. A neat ending for a neat gimmick. The real version is that he put on a suit and spent 11 years as a senior executive selling video for the same company before ending up in the Hall of Fame. Look at those 3 columns side by side, and something becomes obvious. The myth version is always the darkest one, every single time. Whatever really happened, the online retelling reaches for the most bitter explanation available. That is not an accident either. Bitterness performs. A man who broke his leg by accident is a sad story. A man destroyed by hidden enemies is a thriller. One of those gets clicked. And notice something else about that middle column. The kayfabe version is not the villain here. The company was not lying to anybody in a harmful way. Everyone knew the deal, or at least everyone eventually did. Mudlick, Kentucky was a lovely piece of storytelling. It was never presented as investigative journalism. The problem only appears when somebody digs up that middle column decades later and sells it as the third one. So why does the fake version win so often? Because of how these platforms work, and it is worth being honest about that. Algorithms do not measure truth. They cannot. What they measure is behavior. Do people click? Do they keep watching? Those numbers decide what gets shown to more people, and that means the titles that survive are the titles that provoke a reaction fastest. Certain words do that better than others. Banned, hated, exposed, fired. Those words work on you before you have finished reading them. They create an instant question in your mind, and the only way to answer the question is to click. An accurate title cannot compete with that. A look back at Hillbilly Jim's career in the 1980s is a perfectly good video. It will lose every time to the 5 wrestlers who tried to get him banned. Not because it is worse, but because it does not create the same itch. So the system quietly rewards drama over accuracy. Nobody has to be evil for that to happen. It is just what the machine encourages. And then something worse happens on top of it. The title becomes the memory. And in 2018, he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, brought in by his longtime colleague, Jimmy Hart. Here is the detail that finishes this story perfectly. When he got up to accept that honor, with a room full of the industry watching and every opportunity in the world to settle old scores, his speech was about gratitude. Thanks to his peers, thanks to management, thanks to the fans. Not one grudge, Not one name called out, not one hint of the bitterness that the internet has spent years inventing for him, because there was nothing to be bitter about. That is the man the headline describes as being surrounded by enemies. A performer who was liked by nearly everyone he worked with, protected by the biggest star in the business, trusted by the office for over a decade after he stopped wrestling, and honored at the end of it all. His real story does not need 5 secret villains. It already has everything. A fan who climbed over the barrier and became a star. A rookie trained on camera by Hulk Hogan. A broken leg that could have ended it all before it started. And a comeback that worked. Matches against Roddy Piper, King Kong Bundy, and Big John Studd. A friendship with Andre the Giant that lasted years on the road. Respect for the toughest men in the sport, freely given. A second career in a suit. A third one behind a microphone. And a Hall of Fame ring at the end of it. Nobody needed to make anything up. The truth was always more than enough. That is the real lesson here, and it goes far beyond one wrestler. Wrestling history is genuinely strange and genuinely great, and it is at its best when the real parts and the fake parts are kept separate. Kayfabe is brilliant. The storylines, the villains, the impossible feuds, all of it is worth celebrating for exactly what it is. But it stops being fun the moment somebody dresses it up as a documentary. So the next time you see a title telling you which wrestlers somebody hated, or feared, or tried to have banned, ask one simple question. Where is the interview? If nobody can show it to you, you already have your answer. Now I want to hear from you. What is another wrestling story you think has been twisted or completely made up online? Drop it in the comments below, because there are plenty more of these, and some of them have been repeated so often that people treat them as fact. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.